Philosophy, East and West, core differences. Philosophy in the West is very different from philosophy in the East. In fact, the Eastern word is darshan, and that is a combination of philosophy, psychology, spirituality, theology, culture. It's an integrated package instead of like in the Western context where you have a very clearly delineated areas of philosophy, psychology, theology, culture. Because there is no equivalent word to darshan in English, we use the word philosophy, but actually it's not that. The word does not do justice to what we wish to communicate. So let us say in the West it is philosophy, and the East it is a package that we are comparing. And when we do a comparative study, it's a very large area. There would be similarities and there would be differences. So we will focus on differences. I believe in some lecture before, I have also dealt with something in the same context of East and West, either from point of view of spirituality or philosophy. And there I think I covered both the similarity and differences. But I think that was specific to enlightenment. Today let us see another set of differences which are more fundamental. So let us look at the core differences. A comparative study of Eastern and Western philosophies is a very big area, very large area. There are both commonalities and differences. We will today focus on the differences. And within differences, there are two kinds of differences. Some differences are on the surface, they are not so deep, and other differences are at the very core. Today we'll focus only on the core differences. The first difference between philosophy in East and West is the way they developed. They developed in very different societies, in very different time periods, amidst very different type of people. And that has given a very different flavor to the philosophies themselves. So right from the conditions of birth, the differences, the core differences start. So the first core difference is the difference in the conditions of birth. The second core difference, or if we were to look at more core differences, here we have a list of 7 of them. First, the Eastern philosophy or darshan is essentially based upon pluralism and openness, whereas the Western philosophical tradition is based largely upon singularism and, in a way, comparatively speaking, closedness. It's very important to go into singularism and pluralism. In the East, there always have been competing darshans, competing philosophies, or rather competing packages. There is a Jain darshan, there is a Buddha darshan, there is a Vedic darshan, there is a Tantric darshan, there is a Yogic darshan. And no darshan had a problem with a competing darshan in the sense of trying to annihilate the other or attack the other. There was no crusade of one darshan against another. Once a darshan was established, there also was an openness to change it from inside, or at times overrule a scriptural injunction because of a practice of a lineage. One parallel is in music, where instead of in the Western classical tradition, you try to replay to perfection what the masters have laid down. In the Eastern Indian, particularly the Hindu forms of music, systems of music, in the Hindu systems of music, you don't try to re-perform what was laid down by the master. Rather, you are free to take the basic structure and feel free to be creative on your own. And this largely is the spirit which also informs the Eastern and the Western philosophical traditions. Right? Within a school, it's not so easy to digress from what the masters had said. And it's very difficult. You have to really work hard to digress, which is very easy in the East. Second core difference is about a list of fundamental concepts that any philosophy has to deal with. Concepts related to God or the nature of reality, structure of the universe, consciousness, karma, rebirth, reincarnation, concept of time, and the concept of human history. On all these fundamental concepts, there is a fundamental difference between the East and the West. In the East, given the plurality, there are various beliefs on the nature of reality. From at one end, the agnostic belief that there is nothing to know, to on the other end, that everything can be known, to something in between which says part of it can be known and part of it is unknowable. On structure of the universe, the Eastern concept is that there are zones of the universe. The zone of matter, energy, and force is what we see. But there are other zones of life energy, of emotion, of thought, of karma, and of pure consciousness and bliss. And these are the zones of the universe that science has not explored as yet. So the concept of the structure of the universe is very different. The concept of consciousness also is very different. Consciousness in the East is not an epiphenomenon. Rather, it is seen as fundamental fact of nature, which cannot be reduced to anything other than itself. And the consciousness is seen as immanent, not only as the ground of creation, but also immanent in creation. And then there are various ways of looking at this consciousness, various stations the consciousness takes. The ordinary station in which human consciousness comes to exist, and it is as we experience it. Two rare states of consciousness were states of enlightenment, of no thought, no feeling, of pure awareness and bliss. Two, a station in consciousness where one experiences oceanic oneness with existence. To a pure awareness where except the awareness nothing exists. To a nirvana state where there is a all negating absolute. And all these rare stations of consciousness are also factored in the Eastern conceptualization. The Eastern conceptualization also is centered around core concepts of karma, rebirth, and a concept of time which is circular or a spiral within a circle, which is very different from the linear concept of time we find in the West. And then the element of design in creation, element of design in nature, in human evolution, in human history, and the history of the planet, which is very different from the world is out there for the making of man, rather making by man. So the element of design is believed to be more powerful than the force of free will. and the capability and action of man. So on these fundamental concepts of philosophy, of nature of reality, structure of universe, consciousness, human consciousness, karma, rebirth, nature of time, nature of human history. On these fundamental concepts, the East and the West are very apart. There are core differences on these points. Third point of core difference is the point of rare experience. The whole tradition of the East is based on rare experiences of what we call enlightenment experiences. The whole spirituality, which is at the center of the Eastern thinking, is based upon rare experiences. And these are not experiences that all human beings experience. These are experiences which rarely happen and often take a long preparation for it to happen. Called enlightenment experiences, and it's not one. Enlightenment is a category word which covers 7 to 8 different types of rare experiences. And it is in those rare experiences when somebody has gone into and contemplates upon, either in that experience or after that experience, that one is able to understand the revered books in India. Because unless you have those rare experiences or can actually at least conceptually empathize with those rare experiences, the Indian psychophilosophy won't make meaning or won't seem credible or won't seem interesting. What are the types of these rare experiences, these enlightenment experiences? I have detailed out in one of the lectures on, it's called effective enlightenment. Fourth core difference is in terms of what we discussed before, the darshan, a package versus a very clearly delineated academic discipline of philosophy. Fifth is the naturalness, organicity, and mysticism, which the East is rooted into and embraces. The East is still not alienated like the West, and that comes out in darshan or philosophy. Naturalness, organicity, rootedness in existence, and a belief in mystical area of life, which involves mystical sciences and mystical powers and mystical practices, is very alien to the Western way of thinking. There are core differences on these three elements. Sixth point of core difference is the holistic approach in the East versus a focused, reductionist, isolationist approach in the West. And the seventh is the goal of life. In the Western tradition, the goal of life, either the agnostic, atheistic, materialistic parts of the Western thought don't go into the goal of life. Some material schools which believe in determinism, like Marxism, they do talk of a goal of life in a deterministic way, ideological way, but most schools of philosophy don't prescribe a goal of life, at least not the recent existential ones. Whereas in the East, it's very clear that there is a almost a consensus opinion that enlightenment is the goal of life. It's very different from the West. And this enlightenment is a state of no thought, no affect, high awareness and bliss. This is the most common experience of enlightenment, although it can be experienced in a variety of ways, which I described before. described also in another session, effective enlightenment. One more area of core difference is the books which are revered in the East and the West. What are the differences in the nature of those books which are revered in the East and the West in the area of philosophy or spirituality? Books revered in the West are essentially based upon singularism, that there is one truth, I know that truth. If you don't know, it's my duty to bring you to the path of truth, and I won't hesitate to use any lure or force to achieve my objective. Versus in the East, the books are based upon pluralism, which says that wise men can see the same truth in different ways. So there is no question of being fanatic on one truth and converting everyone else to that truth. One outcome, as I said before many times, is the natural, historical, logical end of singularism is a crusade. It may be a crusade or it may be a jihad, but the natural, historical, logical end of the conceptual foundation of singularism is into a crusade or a jihad. And therefore, if we wish to be free from crusades and jihads in future, the only way out is to shift from singularism to pluralism. So one difference is the revered books of the East are based upon singularism, of the West are based upon singularism, of the East are based upon pluralism. Second core difference is, when it comes to the revered books, in the East, there is no one revered book, but there is a collection of revered books. Whereas in the West, usually there is one book followed by followers. And this is true more of the religious sphere rather than of the philosophical sphere. But in the philosophical sphere, we see that in Marxism, we see that in Wokism. The third important core difference is the revered books of the East are essentially based upon a tradition. It's not one person who has authored a book or given revelation of into a book. These books are created over centuries, and it's a tradition of adding to those books versus a single revelation in the West. And this applies to the philosophical aspect also. We can see the difference in terms of the nature and the content of Vedas and Upanishads from the East and Bible from the West. We can also see the difference of the way darshan is written in books versus the way philosophy, psychology, and theology is written in popular books. Sixth difference is the books are written after having in the East, the revered books are written after experiencing those rare states of enlightenment. It is not intellectual writing unlike in the West. It is largely experiential, an experience of a rare state. It is not an intellectual activity. This is the fundamental difference between East and West. So if you don't respect those rare states, or you don't believe in them, or you have not experienced even a bit of it, it's very difficult to understand the revered books of the East. And a very important element is there is no absolute supremacy of any book in the East, quite different from the West. Often after centuries of a revered book having been written, the practicing disciples often come to conclude that if there is a contradiction, the practice of a lineage will prevail over a scriptural injunction, which is valuing experience more than a traditionally given injunction. Another important aspect of core difference between the East and the West is on the parameter of alienation. The Eastern philosophy, Eastern darshan, Eastern spirituality is organically anchored. And if you look at any darshan, it's an organically anchored, internally consistent system. If you look at any darshan, it's very comprehensive. I should also put the word comprehensive. In the East, every darshan or philosophy or philosophy package, as we can call it, is an organically anchored, internally consistent, comprehensive system. So every darshan has its own ontology, its own cosmology, its own cultural prescriptions, its own path to enlightenment, its own definition of enlightenment, its own definition of reality, its own definition of human history. Contradistinction to this, in the West, we see philosophy is deeply alienated from existence. There is a subject-object gulf. There is a philosophy-nature gulf. There is a object-reality gulf. And this alienation pervades through the Western philosophy. In the East, therefore, if you look at it psychologically, there is still an openness to relate at a deep psychological level. In the West, at the very depth of the psyche, we see there is a rage, there is a disappointment so deep that the West is ready to accept loneliness and alienation instead of relating organically to existence and reality. There is almost a repulsive anger towards the organic, towards the traditional. It's almost like a fashion of modernity, a totalitarian fashion of modernity. In the East, mythology and archetypal parts of oneself are a living reality, completely different in the West, which has done away with its mythology and archetypal reality and its organic connection to nature and existence. In the West, we see a childish murder of naturalness by childish reason. We see this most clearly in cultural Marxism and wokeism. Unfortunately, alienation is a Western creation but exported to the East primarily out of colonialism and primarily out of success in the Industrial Revolution. And one of the struggles of the East today is freedom from the Western alienation, because the Western imported alienation is now trying to establish itself in the East, and the East is struggling to break free from it. And the Western alienation is rooted in many foundations. One of the strong foundations is the movement of philosophy from Descartes to Kant. And one of the goals of a philosophical resurgence in the East is to be free from this imported alienation of Western philosophy. Thank you.